I just need my papers. Stop right there.
Please, officer, they're inside.
I said stop. Don't move. This is my house. I need them. Hands where I can see them. Now.
Move one more step and this will get much worse for you. Officer, I'm confused. You just told me I could go inside my own home and get our identification. Are you not listening to me? I gave you a direct order. Please let go. You're hurting me. Let go of my husband. He didn't do anything. Fear spread across the faces of the elderly couple. Nolan, come outside. Someone is hurting your father. A large man stepped into the sunlight and crossed the yard with steady, fearless steps. Officer, I strongly suggest you take your hands off my father. Officer Derek Carver had no idea he was bullying the father of the one man he could not afford to turn into an enemy. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed because the next story is one you won't want to miss. The sun rested soft and golden over Cedar Hollow Lane. Birds called from the oak trees. Sprinklers whispered across the lawns down the block. It was the kind of peaceful morning that could make a person forget. The world still had sharp corners. Russell Whitaker was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around his tomato plants. His knees were not as forgiving as they used to be, but he did not complain. This garden was his. This house was his. Decades of mortgage payments, repairs, sacrifice, and stubborn faith had made sure of that. Every brick held a memory. Every worn step carried the sound of birthdays, quiet arguments, late-night prayers, and mornings when he and Vivian had chosen to keep going even when money was thin and life was hard. "You're going to wear yourself out here," Vivian said, kneeling beside him with her own garden gloves. She had been his wife for most of their lives, and she still teased him with the same warmth she had carried since they were young. "Better than wearing out my spirit sitting inside watching bad news," Russell said. Vivian laughed, and for a little while, everything felt ordinary. Across the street, behind a curtain of white lace, Marla Voss watched them. She had been watching for a while. Marla did not garden. She did not sit on the porch with coffee, waving at neighbors the way other people did. She watched, and lately, every time she looked at the Whitaker house, she did not see a family home. She saw money slipping away from her. She picked up her phone. "Emergency services. What is your emergency?" "Yes, hello," Marla said, smoothing her voice into concern. "I'm calling about my neighborhood. There are people outside a house on Cedar Hollow Lane, and I don't recognize them. They look like they might be casing the property. I think something is wrong." It was a lie, not a misunderstanding, not a nervous mistake, a lie shaped carefully enough to sound like concern. She knew exactly who Russell and Vivian Whitaker were. She had known them for years. But Marla had learned something ugly about the world. When a lie sounds frightened enough, it can move faster than the truth. Before long, a patrol car rolled to the curb, tires crunching over loose gravel. Russell looked up first. He felt it before he fully understood it. That old tightening in the chest, that old warning bell. The feeling many black men of his generation had learned to recognize, long before they had words for it. Officer Derek Carver stepped out of the cruiser wearing sunglasses, one hand resting close to his belt, as if trouble had already been decided before he said a word. "Morning," Carver said. It was not a greeting. It sounded more like a command wearing a polite mask. "Morning, officer," Russell said, rising slowly and brushing dirt from his knees. "Is something wrong? Got a call about suspicious activity at this address." Carver's eyes moved over them, slow and judging. "You two live here." "We do," Vivian said, stepping closer to her husband. "This is our home." Carver did not soften. If anything, his jaw tightened. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Russell blinked. "Identification? For standing in my own yard?" "That's what I said." There was something flat in the way Carver spoke. Bored, cold, like he had already made up his mind. And now he was only waiting for Russell to give him an excuse. Vivian felt her stomach twist. She had read the stories. She had seen the videos. Small encounters that grew dangerous in a breath. Simple questions that ended in grief. She was not about to let her husband become another name people whispered over for a week and then forgot. "Officer, we haven't done anything," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "We're just gardening." Ma'am, I didn't ask for your opinion. Carver's tone cut through the warm air. I asked for identification. Russell felt his pride rise, but he pushed it down. A lifetime had taught him how dangerous pride could become when another man held a badge and wanted obedience more than truth. It's inside, Russell said carefully. In my wallet, on the kitchen counter. Then go get it. Russell hesitated. The front door was only a few steps away, but the way Carver's hand hovered near his belt made even that simple walk feel like crossing a minefield. I'm going to step inside now, Russell said slowly, lifting both hands a little, palms open. Through that door. Just to get my wallet. Carver said nothing. He only watched from behind dark glasses, unreadable and tense, as Russell turned toward his own house. Vivian's heart beat hard in her ears. The street, usually so open and peaceful, suddenly felt terribly small. Russell placed one foot on the first porch step. That was all it took. Stop right there. Carver's voice cracked across the yard. Don't move. Russell froze, one hand still raised. I'm just getting my identification. I said don't move. Carver was already moving around the front of the cruiser, fast. His hand was no longer hovering near his belt. It was gripping it. Turn around, slowly. Officer, I told you my identification is inside. You're not listening to me, Carver snapped. I gave you a direct order. Russell turned around slowly, carefully. His hands rose near his shoulders. He had done everything right. He had spoken calmly. He had announced every move. He had shown his hands. None of it mattered. That was the cruel part. He could be patient. He could be polite. He could lower his voice until it barely disturbed the air. But when a man has already decided what he wants to see, even the truth can stand in front of him with open hands and still be ignored. Carver closed the distance and grabbed Russell's arm, fingers digging into the soft skin above his elbow. Ow! Russell winced as the force made his knees dip. You're hurting me. Russell! Vivian screamed. She rushed forward without thinking, placing her small body between her husband and the officer. She was shaking with fear, but fury carried her voice. Let go of him. He didn't do anything. Ma'am, back up. Carver's grip did not loosen. It tightened. You're hurting an old man for no reason, Vivian said, tears burning in her eyes. He lives here. This is our house. I don't care whose house it is. Carver shoved her back with his free hand, hard enough that she stumbled into the porch railing. Back up! Up and down the street, doors began to open. Curtains shifted. A teenage boy on a bike stopped at the curb and pulled out his phone. Across the street, an older woman stepped onto her porch, gasping, her own phone rising to record. Somebody help them! The woman called. But nobody moved closer. Nobody wanted to be next. And that silence hurt in a different way. Russell could feel the eyes on him, could feel the phones recording, could feel the whole street witnessing the moment. Yet the space around him stayed empty. Help was close enough to see, but too frightened to move. Russell's arm throbbed under Carver's grip. His chest felt tight. His breath came short and shallow. He was an elderly man standing in his own front yard, handled like a criminal, and all he had done was try to reach for his wallet. Please, Russell said, and now his careful calm began to crack. Please, I haven't done anything wrong. That's what everyone says, Carver muttered, twisting Russell's arm farther behind his back. Vivian's mind raced. Panic climbed her throat. She thought of her son. Her son was inside the house, home on leave, the one person she believed could make this stop without losing control. Nolan! She screamed toward the house, her voice tearing through the morning. Nolan, help! Please, help us! For one terrible breath, nothing happened. Then the front door flew open. A man filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, heavy chest, strong arms. He was so large that the sunlight seemed to stop behind him. He moved fast for someone his size, crossing the porch in controlled strides, his eyes fixed on the scene in the yard. Carver's grip on Russell loosened slightly as he looked toward the new arrival. His eyes widened behind his sunglasses. Get back, Carver barked, releasing Russell and turning fully, his hand dropping toward the taser on his hip. Sir, I need you to stop right there. Nolan did not stop walking. He did not run either. His steps were measured, controlled, deliberate. The steps of a man trained not to panic, even when every instinct in his body told him to move faster. "That's my father," Nolan said. His voice was low and even, cutting through the chaos like cold water. "Take your hands off him." "I said get back," Carver shouted, and now something close to fear cracked through his voice. His fingers fumbled at the taser holster. "I will use this taser. I swear I will." The neighbors went silent. Phones stayed raised. Everyone held their breath. Vivian pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, watching her son close the distance between himself and the man who had just put hands on his father. Russell, holding his bruised arm, could only whisper his son's name. "Nolan!" Nolan Whitaker stopped a few feet from Officer Carver, close enough to see sweat gathering at the man's hairline, far enough to keep his own hands visible and open at his sides. He did not raise his fists. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, calm and solid in the middle of the storm, and placed himself between Carver and his parents. "Get back!" Carver shouted again, but this time his voice wavered. His hand gripped the taser so hard his knuckles paled. "I will drop you." "You don't need to do that," Nolan said. His tone stayed steady. It was the voice of a man trained to remain level while the world burned around him. "Sir, I need you to back away, boss, right now," Carver said, but the command sounded thinner with every word. "My name is Nolan Whitaker," Nolan said, slow and clear. "I'm a petty officer with the United States Navy, assigned to a special warfare unit. That man you grabbed is my father. This is my parents' home." The words landed over the yard like thunder. Carver blinked. His grip on the taser shifted. "I don't care what you are. Check my belt," Nolan said. He lifted his shirt slowly, deliberately, revealing the military identification clipped at his waist. "It's right there. You can see it for yourself." A younger officer named Rowan Hale had been standing near the cruiser, watching the whole thing unfold with growing unease. He stepped closer now, his eyes catching something on Nolan's forearm, a tattoo, worn slightly with age, but unmistakable. The special warfare trident inked into his skin. "Carver," Rowan said quietly. "Look at his arm." Carver's eyes flicked down. The trident. The identification, the way this man, easily powerful enough to overwhelm him if he wanted to, had not raised a single hand in anger, had not even raised his voice. Something cracked behind Carver's sunglasses. The certainty that had carried him through the encounter began to wobble. The assumption that made him grab an elderly man's arm without a second thought began to look smaller, uglier, and harder to defend. "That doesn't change anything," Carver said, but his voice had shrunk. "I still have. It changes everything," Rowan muttered, stepping between his partner and Nolan with one hand lifted toward Carver. "Derek, stand down. Now." On the street, the neighbors were silent. Phones still pointed. Nobody spoke. Vivian leaned against the porch railing, one hand pressed to her chest, watching her son stand perfectly still while an officer debated whether to use a taser on him in his own parents' yard. Russell cradled his bruised arm and felt something hot and furious rise in his throat. He had lived on this street for decades. He had mowed this lawn, paid taxes, waved to neighbors, helped people carry groceries, lived quietly. And it had taken his son announcing his military service for the officer to look at him like a human being instead of a threat. Carver's hand slowly came off the taser. He swallowed hard, glancing at the phones pointed at him, at his partner's pale face, at the old man holding his arm nearby. "I'm going to need everyone to calm down." Nolan did not move. "We are calm," Nolan said quietly. "You're the one who needs to think very carefully about what you do next." The street held its breath, waiting to see if Officer Derek Carver would finally listen. Carver lowered his hand fully from his belt, but his face stayed flushed and tight with the anger of a man humiliated in front of witnesses. "All right," he said. The words came clipped and forced. "All right. Everyone back off. Show's over." He turned to Russell, who was still rubbing the place where Carver's fingers had dug in hard enough to leave bruises. "Sorry for thee," Carver said, refusing to meet his eyes. Misunderstanding. It was not an apology. Not really. Russell had heard real apologies in his life. They had weight. They carried humility. They came with eyes that met yours and a voice willing to sit inside the discomfort. This was none of that. It was the sound a man makes when he wants a moment to end. Not the sound a man makes when he understands the harm he caused. Russell heard the difference. So did Vivian. So did every neighbor standing on a porch with a phone in hand. Officer Rowan Hale placed a hand on Carver's shoulder and guided him toward the cruiser before he could make anything worse. "Let's go, Derek, now." The officers climbed into the patrol car. Carver did not look back as the engine started. The cruiser rolled away from the curb, scattering gravel, and soon disappeared around the corner. Slowly the neighbors retreated into their homes, phones lowered, doors closed, curtains settled back into place. The street returned to its ordinary rhythm, as if nothing had happened at all. As if an elderly man had not just been grabbed and threatened in his own yard, as if his son had not just stood face to face with a drawn taser. Nolan turned to his parents, and only then did his shoulders drop from the hard, controlled posture he had been holding. "Dad!" He gently took Russell's arm and looked at the red marks already forming. "Let me see." "I'm fine," Russell said, though his voice shook as the adrenaline drained out of him. "You're not fine. Sit down." Russell sat on the porch steps. Vivian lowered herself beside him, her hands trembling as she examined the bruising under his sleeve. "That man had no right," she said quietly. Her voice was tight with anger. "No," Nolan said. "He didn't." Later, inside the house, the family sat around the kitchen table. The lamp above them cast warm yellow light over plates of food nobody had much appetite for. Russell picked at his dinner, his injured arm resting carefully on a folded towel. "You should have seen your face," Vivian told Nolan, trying to lighten the room, though her smile did not quite reach her eyes. "That officer nearly fainted when he saw your tattoo." Nolan gave a small smile, but it faded quickly. "I don't like how fast he reached for that taser." "He was scared," Russell said. "Scared of a black man standing up for his family. That's what that was." Vivian set down her fork. "You know what bothers me more?" Both men looked at her. "Marla." Vivian's voice lowered. "She was watching us from her window before that cruiser showed up." Nolan's jaw tightened. "You think she called?" "I don't know," Vivian admitted. "But she's been strange ever since that meeting about the development project. Asking if we'd ever thought about selling. Pushing too hard." Russell waved a hand. "Marla is harmless. Nosy, maybe, but harmless." Nolan did not answer. Something uneasy settled in his chest. A feeling without a clear shape. Years of training had taught him to trust that feeling. It was the kind of instinct that kept people alive in places far more dangerous than a quiet suburban street. After dinner, Nolan walked the perimeter of the house. He checked the locks on every window and door, a habit he could not shake even at home. When he reached the front porch, he stood still for a moment, looking out at the dark, empty street where his father had been grabbed. The street was quiet now, peaceful, ordinary. Nolan reached for the porch light switch and turned it off. "It's over," he murmured to himself. But some stubborn part of him did not believe it. He locked the door and went inside, unaware that across town, in a precinct office glowing beneath fluorescent lights, Officer Derek Carver was beginning to write his version of the story. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a room is not the one on a belt. Sometimes it is a keyboard, a blank report, and a man willing to turn fear into an official record. The precinct was almost empty. Only the hum of lights and the distant clatter of a keyboard filled the hall. Carver sat alone at his desk, staring at the blank incident report on his computer. His face still burned with the memory of it. The phones raised in the street. His partner's horrified stare. That huge man standing calm as still water, while Carver's own hand shook on the taser. He had been humiliated in front of an entire neighborhood. He was not going to let that become the story. His fingers moved over the keyboard, slowly at first, then faster. The lie took shape word by word. He wrote that Russell Whitaker had been uncooperative and evasive. He wrote that Russell had reached for something near the doorway. He wrote that Nolan Whitaker had advanced aggressively, that Carver feared for his safety, that he had been forced to draw his taser because a large man refused multiple commands to stand down. None of it was true. That was what made it so dangerous. It was not wild enough to be dismissed. It was not dramatic enough to raise immediate suspicion. It was ordinary, careful, professional-sounding dishonesty, the kind that could travel through a system with a stamp and a signature. All of it sounded believable. When he reached the section asking for body camera footage, Carver paused. Only for a moment. Then he typed that the equipment had malfunctioned and no footage was available. He submitted the report before conscience could catch up with him. The next day, Russell Whitaker walked into the precinct lobby with Vivian beside him. His bruised arm still ached beneath his sleeve, but his steps were steady. He approached the front desk with quiet determination. "I'd like to file a complaint against Officer Carver," Russell said. "He assaulted me in my own front yard." The desk officer took his information with little interest and slid a thin form across the counter. "Someone will review it." Russell filled in every line carefully. He described the bruise, the shouting, Vivian being shoved and Nolan stepping in. He handed the form back with a small flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe this would be the start of something. Maybe someone would finally be held accountable. That hope did not last. The hardest part of injustice is not always the first wound. Sometimes it is the moment you follow the rules, fill out the form, speak calmly, and realize the door you knocked on was never meant to open for you. Down the hall, in a corner office with his name on the frosted glass, Chief Graham Locke reviewed the documents side by side. Carver's incident report and Russell's complaint. Locke was Carver's uncle. He had been protecting him since the younger man first put on a uniform, and over the years he had learned how to make problems disappear before they became public. He read Russell's complaint twice, his expression unreadable. Then he slid it into a drawer and closed it. The way a man closes a door he never intends to open again. "Foolish kid," Locke muttered, though there was no real anger in it, only the tired irritation of a man cleaning up a mess he had cleaned up before. He pulled Carver's report toward him instead, scanning the fabricated version of an aggressive suspect. It was sloppy, it was obvious, but it was also exactly what he needed. He picked up the phone and called the district attorney's office. "I need a warrant pushed through," Locke said. "Assault on an officer. Resisting arrest. Suspect's name is Nolan Whitaker." There was hesitation on the other end. "Whitaker. Isn't he the Navy man?" "Just get it done," Locke said, cutting him off. "As soon as possible." Before long, the warrant was approved and sitting on a desk not far from where Russell's complaint had been buried in a drawer that would not be opened by anyone who mattered. Locke walked into the bullpen, found officers finishing their lunch, and dropped a folder on the table. "I've got an arrest for you," he said. "Nolan Whitaker. Address is in the file. I want it handled before the day is out." One officer frowned and glanced through the paperwork. "Is this the special warfare guy from that call?" "Doesn't matter what he is," Locke said flatly. "He has a warrant. Pick him up." The officer hesitated, then nodded. Locke walked back to his office, passing the drawer where Russell's complaint sat, under a stack of unrelated paperwork. Untouched, unread, buried. Outside his window, the sun beat down on the parking lot, indifferent to the quiet injustice unfolding inside. Across town, Nolan Whitaker sat on his parents' porch, starting to relax after the chaos, with no idea that a patrol car was already being sent to his address, and that soon he would be standing in handcuffs on his own family lawn. The sun hung low over Cedar Hollow Lane, spreading long shadows across the grass. Nolan knelt beside his father, helping stake the tomato plants that had been knocked loose during the earlier confrontation. Russell's arm was still sore, the bruises dark beneath his sleeve, but he refused to let pain keep him from working in his own garden. "You don't have to do this," Russell said, watching his son drive a wooden stake into the soil with practiced ease. "I've been gardening longer than you've been alive." "I've also been told to rest more than once," Nolan said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Doesn't mean I listened." Russell chuckled. It was the first real laugh either of them had managed since the officer had come to their yard. For a moment, it almost felt as if life might settle back into place. Then a patrol car turned onto the street. Nolan noticed it first. His body went still in that trained way, the way it always did when something in his environment changed. He watched the cruiser slow and stop in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, faces hard and unreadable. Behind them, another car pulled up. Officer Derek Carver climbed out and leaned against his cruiser door with his arms crossed. A thin, satisfied smile crept across his face. "Nolan Whitaker," one of the officers called, walking up the path with a folded paper in hand. Nolan rose slowly and brushed dirt from his knees. "That's me. We have a warrant for your arrest. Assault on a police officer. Resisting arrest." The word struck the yard like a gunshot. For one breath, the garden, the porch, the street, even the birds in the trees seemed to fall silent. The world narrowed to the paper in the officer's hand and the metal cuffs waiting beside it. "What?" Russell scrambled up, forgetting the pain in his arm. "That's a lie. He's the one who attacked us." "Sir, step back," the officer said, already pulling handcuffs from his belt. Vivian burst out of the house, drawn by the commotion. Her hand flew to her mouth when she saw officers approaching her son with cuffs raised. "No, no, please, this is a mistake. Ma'am, stay back," the other officer warned. Nolan did not resist. Every muscle in his body wanted to turn toward his mother, to explain, to shield her from seeing this. But discipline held him still. He knew the difference between strength and reaction, and in that moment, strength meant giving them nothing they could twist. He had learned long ago that resisting would only give men like this exactly what they wanted. He turned and placed his hands behind his back, before anyone had to force them there. His jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "Nolan!" Vivian screamed as the cold metal clicked around her son's wrists. Carver watched beside his cruiser, his smile widening just a little. This was the moment he had wanted since the humiliation in the yard. The moment the man who had exposed his fear would be made small in front of everyone. "Funny how things work out," Carver called, just loud enough for Nolan to hear. "Big, tough Navy hero. Don't look so tough in cuffs." Nolan did not respond. He kept his eyes forward, his face held in practiced calm, even while anger burned beneath his ribs. Neighbors emerged onto porches again, phones rising for the second time. The same teenage boy on his bike stopped at the curb, his mouth open in disbelief. The woman across the street pressed a hand to her chest and shook her head slowly. Russell stood frozen on the lawn. His chest tightened. A sharp pain bloomed behind his ribs, but he swallowed it down because everything else was falling apart around him. He pressed a hand against his sternum and forced himself to breathe. "Dad!" Nolan called as the officers guided him toward the cruiser. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Russell lied, though his face had gone pale. "Don't worry about me. Worry about yourself." The officers guided Nolan into the back seat. The door shut with a final sound that nearly made Vivian's knees give out. Carver stepped to the cruiser window and leaned down with a mocking little salute. "Welcome to the system, hero." The car pulled away, leaving Vivian sobbing on the lawn and Russell pale beside her, one hand still pressed to his aching chest. By that evening, a grainy cell phone video of the arrest had begun spreading online. The caption was simple. They arrested him for defending his parents. Inside the house, Vivian's hands shook as she picked up the phone and called a number a neighbor had given her, a civil rights attorney named Avery Quinn. Avery Quinn arrived at the Whitaker house soon after, carrying a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a legal pad already half filled with notes in the other. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for taking cases other lawyers avoided. Vivian let her in, pale and exhausted after a sleepless night spent refreshing the jail roster on her phone, waiting for proof that her son had been processed safely. "Tell me everything," Avery said, settling at the kitchen table. "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." Russell sat across from her, his bruised arm wrapped lightly, and walked her through it all. Marla watching from the window, the emergency call, Carver's aggression, Nolan stepping between them, the humiliating arrest that followed. Avery listened without interrupting. Her pen moved quickly. Her jaw tightened with every detail. "This cell phone video," she said at last, pulling out her phone and opening the clip that had been circulating online. "It starts after Carver already has your arm. We need the full picture, the part that shows what happened before that." "Several people were filming," Vivian said. "But Officer Carver had a body camera too. Shouldn't that show everything?" Avery's expression hardened. "It should. I requested it." She tapped her finger against the notepad. "The department says the footage is corrupted and cannot be recovered." Russell let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it is." "I don't believe that for a second," Avery said. "Convenient malfunctions don't happen to convenient officers without help. I'll keep pushing, but for now, I need you to think carefully. Do any of your neighbors have security cameras, doorbell cameras, anything facing the street?" Vivian thought, then shook her head. "I don't know, we never paid attention to things like that." "Start paying attention," Avery said, rising and gathering her papers. "I'm going to need every piece of truth I can find before this moves any further." Across town, in a cramped office cluttered with old newspapers and printed articles, journalist Simone Hart leaned over her laptop. The arrest video was paused on her screen. She had seen it shared again and again, each repost angrier than the last. Something about the story caught in her mind and would not let go. A Black Navy service member, arrested after defending his elderly parents from an officer who had clearly crossed a line. It smelled like the kind of story Simone had built her career chasing, the kind that exposed rot hiding just beneath a quiet surface. She had learned that corruption rarely announced itself with thunder. More often, it hid behind neat uniforms, polite statements, missing files, and people who insisted there was nothing to see. She filed a public records request for Officer Derek Carver's personnel file before her coffee had gone cold. When the response came in, Simone almost dropped her mug. Several prior complaints. Excessive force, improper conduct during a traffic stop. Each complaint dismissed soon after it was filed, each one reviewed and closed under the signature of the same man. Chief Graham Locke. Simone leaned back in her chair, pulse quickening. A pattern was not an accident. A pattern was a choice. It meant someone, somewhere, had chosen again and again to look away. She searched Locke's background next. Years on the force, clean public image, community awards, carefully polished speeches about trust and service. Then, buried in an old local newsletter, Simone found a single congratulatory line that made her sit up straighter. It mentioned Derek Carver, nephew of Graham Locke, graduating from the academy. There it was. Family protecting family, a badge protecting a badge. Simone picked up her phone and called Avery Quinn, the attorney representing the Whitaker family. The call connected quickly. "Avery Quinn, my name is Simone Hart. I'm a reporter with The Beacon. I think I have something you need to see." There was a brief pause. "I'm listening," Avery said. "Officer Derek Carver has multiple prior complaints, all dismissed by the same chief. And that chief is his uncle." Silence stretched as the pieces clicked into place on both ends of the line. "Can you meet soon?" Avery finally asked. "I think we need to compare notes." "I'll bring everything I have," Simone said. By the time she ended the call, the light outside her window had begun to soften. And for the first time since she started digging, Simone felt sure this story was bigger than one bad arrest. A quiet coffee shop became the meeting place. Avery Quinn slid into a corner booth across from Simone Hart. A folder of papers lay between them like cards neither woman wanted to play too early. "Carver's history confirms a pattern," Avery said, tapping the printed complaints. "But it doesn't explain why the call was made in the first place. Why the Whitakers? Why now?" Simone pulled out a thinner folder, her eyes bright with the focus of a reporter who knew she had found something important. "I dug into property records around Cedar Hollow Lane. There's a development company called Northline Partners buying up parcels along that street. Quiet acquisitions, nothing flashy. And Marla Voss is listed as a minority stakeholder." Simone slid a printed document across the table. "She stands to make a major payout if every property on that block sells before the rezoning vote." Avery stared at the page, jaw tightening. She called the police on her neighbors, people she knew, for money. "It gets worse," Simone said. "I pulled homeowners association meeting notes." Marla specifically asked the Whitakers if they'd considered selling. Russell told her no, politely but clearly. Avery leaned back and exhaled slowly. So that emergency call was not confusion. It was not fear. It was strategy. "That's how it looks," Simone said. Avery closed the folder. Her mind was already racing through how this new piece changed the case. It was not only about one officer's bias anymore. It was about a calculated scheme, dressed up as a worried phone call. She thanked Simone, gathered the documents, and headed for her car, eager to bring the family this new thread before court. Avery had handled difficult cases before, but this one carried a different weight. It was not only about clearing Nolan's name. It was about proving that Russell and Vivian's quiet, ordinary life had value, and that no one had the right to shake it for profit. But she never made the call she planned to make. Inside the Whitaker house, Russell sat in his recliner, with a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him. His face was pale and damp, even though the room was warm. "Russell." Vivian looked up from the couch, noticing the strange stillness in his posture. "Are you all right?" "Just tired," he murmured. But his hand had drifted to his chest, pressing lightly against the same place he had touched when Nolan was arrested. "You said that before, too." Vivian stood and crossed the room, fear sharpening her voice. "Russell, look at me." His breathing had gone shallow. Sweat shone across his forehead. "Russell." He did not answer. His eyes fluttered. His body sagged sideways in the recliner. Vivian screamed for help and grabbed the phone. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it before she managed to call emergency services. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Vivian sat hunched in a plastic chair, twisting a tissue into shreds between her fingers. When Nolan walked through the double door after being released on bail, he still wore the same wrinkled clothes from his arrest. But the moment he saw his mother's face, every bit of his own exhaustion vanished. "Mom!" He dropped to one knee beside her chair. "What happened? Is Dad okay?" "They said it was stress," Vivian whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. His heart. "They're calling it a minor cardiac event, but Nolan, his face. I've never seen him look like that." A doctor came out and explained gently that Russell was stable, but they were keeping him under observation. The stress had taken a toll on a heart already strained by age and grief. Nolan sat beside his father's hospital bed, deep into the quiet hours, watching the slow rise and fall of Russell's chest. The soft beeping of machines filled the dim room. Russell's hand, still bruised from Carver's grip, rested limp against the white blanket. "This is my fault," Nolan murmured to the room. "If I hadn't stepped outside." The words came from the place guilt always finds first, the part of the heart that tries to make pain easier by blaming itself. Nolan knew better in his mind, but his heart had not caught up. "Don't you dare!" Russell's voice rasped. His eyes fluttered open. "Don't you dare blame yourself for standing up for your family." Nolan's throat tightened. "Dad, I'm proud of you," Russell said, weak but certain. "No matter what happens next, I need you to know that." Nolan gently took his father's bruised hand in his own. For a long while, neither of them said anything else. Russell was sent home with strict orders to rest. Avery arrived at the house soon after with the news about Marla and the development company, hoping the truth might finally begin to tip the scales back toward justice. The story broke online with a headline that spread before many people in the city had finished their first cup of coffee. "Pattern of abuse. Officers' complaints buried by family connection." Simone Hart had written every word carefully. She laid out the dismissed complaints against Officer Derek Carver, his family relationship with Chief Graham Locke, and the timeline connecting it to the arrest of a decorated Navy service member who had defended his elderly parents. The article spread quickly. Local news vans soon parked outside the precinct. The pressure worked. Avery received a call from a contact inside Internal Affairs, confirming that a formal investigation had been opened not just into Carver's conduct, but into Locke's handling of complaints that had crossed his desk for years. "This is real movement," Avery told the Whitakers at their kitchen table. Investigations like this don't appear from nowhere. Someone with authority is finally paying attention. Russell, still recovering and under doctor's orders to take things slowly, sat with a blanket over his knees. Cautious hope flickered behind his tired eyes. The momentum grew when a retired officer named Rafael Mendez contacted Internal Affairs directly. He offered to testify about an incident from years earlier, when he had seen Carver shove a handcuffed suspect face first into a patrol car for no reason beyond the man's sharp words. Mendez had filed a report at the time. It had vanished into the same silence as every other complaint. "He's confirming the pattern," Avery told Vivian over the phone, unable to hide the rare excitement in her voice. A retired officer with nothing to gain by lying. This is exactly the kind of witness that can move a case. For the first time since the nightmare began, the Whitaker house felt lighter. Vivian cooked a full dinner: fried chicken, greens, warm cornbread from the oven. The kitchen filled with smells that had not drifted through the house since before everything changed. Nolan set the table while Russell, color slowly returning to his face, told an old story about the time he nearly ruined their first apartment trying to fry catfish. Vivian laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. For a few precious hours, the family allowed themselves to believe the worst might be behind them. "Avery thinks the charges could be dropped," Vivian said, passing the cornbread to Nolan. "With everything coming out about Carver and his uncle, she says the prosecutor may not want to move forward." Nolan allowed himself a small, cautious smile. "I'd like to believe that." "Believe it," Russell said firmly. "After everything we've survived, we deserve some good news." Just as dinner was ending, Nolan's phone buzzed against the table. He looked at the screen, and his stomach tightened. It was his commander's administrative office. He stepped into the hallway to answer, the sound of his family's laughter fading behind him. "Petty Officer Whitaker," the voice on the line said, crisp and formal. "We're calling regarding the pending charge against you. Command is aware of the situation and the local investigation." "Yes, sir," Nolan said, bracing himself. "I want to be direct. A pending assault charge, regardless of circumstances, places your security clearance under review. We are monitoring the matter closely, but until this is resolved, your status remains uncertain." Nolan closed his eyes and pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself. Everything he had worked for, the training, the deployments, the sacrifice, his identity, all of it now hung in the balance because of a lie written by a man who could not stand being exposed in front of a crowd. "Understood, sir," Nolan said, keeping his voice even. "Thank you for letting me know." The call ended. Nolan stood alone in the hallway, staring at the warm light spilling from the kitchen, where his family had finally found a small piece of laughter again. He did not want to ruin it. Not tonight. Not after everything they had survived. He took a slow breath, pushed his shoulders back, and walked into the kitchen with a careful smile. "Everything okay?" Vivian asked. "Everything's fine," Nolan said, sitting beside his father. But as he reached for his fork, the warmth of the meal could not chase away the cold knot forming in his stomach, the quiet fear that the hope in that kitchen might not survive what was coming next. Chief Graham Locke sat across from District Attorney Leon Mercer in a small downtown conference room. Morning light cut hard lines across the table between them. Locke had requested the meeting before the internal investigation could gain more ground. "I'm aware of the article," Locke said, voice measured and controlled. "I'm aware of the optics, but Nolan Whitaker's charge has nothing to do with that. Assault is assault." Mercer rubbed his temples. "Graham, the whole department is under a microscope right now. If we push this forward and it turns out your nephew lied, that's exactly why we should push forward," Locke interrupted smoothly. "If we drop it now, it looks like we're caving to pressure. It looks like we're admitting guilt before any investigation concludes. Let the court sort out the truth. Internal Affairs can handle its review separately." Mercer hesitated, weighing the risk on both sides. "Fine," he said at last. "We proceed. But if this falls apart, it falls on you." Locke forced a tight smile. "It won't." He left the meeting having bought himself time. But he knew time would not be enough. The video was still the threat. That afternoon, a clip began circulating from an anonymous account. It was edited down to a few sharp seconds. Nolan crossing the lawn fast, his hands tense at his sides. Carver stepping back with his hand on the taser. Cut! No context, no Russell being grabbed, no Vivian being shoved, no sign of Carver's aggression before Nolan came outside. Just a large black man moving toward an officer. The caption claimed the hero had lunged first and told people to judge for themselves. The clip spread faster than the article had. That was the other cruelty. A lie with pictures can outrun a truth with context. It does not need to explain itself. It only has to make people feel certain for a moment, and that moment can be enough to hurt someone deeply. By evening, the tide had turned violently. Comment sections filled with strangers calling Nolan dangerous, dishonest, a threat to public safety. News outlets that had spoken with sympathy now covered the edited clip with cautious doubt. Nolan sat in his parents' living room, scrolling through the wreckage on his phone, jaw aching from how tightly he clenched it. "It's edited," Avery said through the speakerphone, furious and controlled. "Anyone with eyes can see the cut. But right now it doesn't matter. It's already everywhere." That same evening, Nolan's phone rang again. His command, Petty Officer Whitaker. Given the new developments and the prosecutor's decision to proceed, your security clearance is formally suspended pending the outcome of your case. Nolan closed his eyes. The words landed like a physical blow. Everything. Years of his life, his entire future, hanging from a thread held by people who had never met him, who knew nothing beyond a false police report and a clipped video stripped of truth. He ended the call and sat in silence. At first, he did not notice the sound from the kitchen, a low groan. Then, the heavy scrape of a chair against the floor. "Russell!" Vivian's voice sharpened with sudden panic. Nolan was on his feet instantly. He ran into the kitchen and found his father slumped against the table, one hand clutching his chest, face gray and damp with sweat, breath ragged and shallow. "Dad!" Nolan dropped beside him, training taking over even as panic threatened to tear through him. "Dad, stay with me. Mom, call emergency services now." Vivian's hands shook as she dialed, her voice breaking as she gave the address and begged the dispatcher to hurry. Nolan eased his father gently to the floor, checked his pulse, and kept his voice low and steady even while his own heart hammered against his ribs. "You're going to be okay. Stay with me. Stay with me, Dad." Russell's eyes fluttered, unfocused. His lips moved without sound. The ambulance arrived soon after, though to Nolan, kneeling on the kitchen floor with his father's weak pulse beneath his fingers, it felt like a lifetime. At the hospital, doctors rushed Russell into emergency care. His condition was critical, but stable. His heart had suffered more damage than the first scare. Nolan stood in the hallway outside intensive care, hands still trembling, watching through the narrow window as machines tracked his father's fragile heartbeat. Vivian wept quietly beside him, her face buried against his arm. Everything they had hoped for at dinner, the laughter, the cautious optimism, the feeling that light had finally returned, now felt like it belonged to another family, another life. All of it swept away by a lie, an edited video, and a system more eager to protect itself than protect the truth. The next stretch of days passed in the dim quiet of the hospital. Soft beeps, nurses changing shifts, doctors speaking carefully about strain on the heart, rest, and the dangers of stress for a man Russell's age. Vivian stayed in the chair beside his bed, almost without moving, her hand wrapped around his, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest as if it were the only thing holding the world together. Nolan paced the hallway, phone gripped in his hand, the notice about his suspended clearance still glowing in his mind. He felt useless in a way training had never prepared him for. He had been taught how to read a room, control fear, endure pain, and protect the people beside him. But no one had trained him for waiting outside hospital doors while strangers debated his future through paperwork and edited images. He could not see the enemy. He could not fight it with his hands. It was slowly dismantling everything his family had built, one official lie at a time. Simone Hart came to the hospital after hearing from Avery about Russell's second heart episode. She found Vivian in the family waiting room, sitting alone while Nolan went for coffee. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm so sorry," Simone said gently, taking the seat beside her. "I won't take much of your time." Vivian studied the reporter's face, searching for sincerity, or maybe simply for someone willing to listen. "You're the one who wrote about Carver," she said. "About his uncle." "I am," Simone said. "I know you've been through more than any family should, but right now, the public only knows pieces of your story, and pieces are easy to twist. That edited clip proved it." Vivian's jaw tightened. "They turned my son into a monster with a few seconds of video." "I know," Simone said, "and I think the only way to fight that is to let people hear the whole truth in your own words. Not a clip, not a headline. You." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her hands. Hands worn by gardening, cooking, dishwashing, and holding her family together through every storm life had thrown at them. She thought of Russell, pale and fragile in a hospital bed. She thought of Nolan, carrying guilt that was never his to carry. She thought of every name she had ever seen pass through the news. Every family left to fight silence alone. "All right," Vivian said at last, lifting her chin. "Ask me anything." The interview lasted a long time. Vivian's voice stayed steady, even as tears slipped down her cheeks. She did not speak like someone chasing attention. She spoke like a mother who had run out of ways to protect her family, except telling the truth as plainly as she could. She described the terror of watching her husband's arm bruise under an officer's grip, the helplessness of seeing her son handcuffed in their yard, the heartbreak of sitting beside a hospital bed more than once because stress had nearly taken the man she loved. She held nothing back. Simone published the piece under a headline that carried a mother's voice, a mother's plea. "We just wanted to be left alone." It spread even faster than the edited clip, this time carrying raw humanity no clever cut could erase. Public sympathy, which had wavered after the doctored footage, began turning firmly back toward the family. While Vivian spoke to Simone, Avery Quinn went door to door along Cedar Hollow Lane, knocking on porches and asking the same question again and again. "Do you have a security camera? Anything facing the street from the day of the first incident?" Most people shook their heads apologetically. Some cameras were pointed too narrowly. Some had already overwritten footage. Some captured only driveways, trees, or front doors. After too many dead ends, Avery tried one last house near the end of the block. An elderly man named Everett Bell opened the door. He rarely left his property and kept an old security system above his garage, more from habit than expectation. "I think it still records," Everett said, scratching his head. "I never really check it." "Would you mind if I took a look?" Avery asked. Everett led her inside to an old computer connected to the camera system. The screen flickered awake, showing grainy footage, stretching back for a while. Avery scrolled carefully through the archive. Her pulse quickened when she found the morning of the first confrontation. The footage lined up with the day Marla had made her call. Before she could open the clip, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown caller. The identification on the screen showed the United States Navy. She stepped onto Everett's porch and answered cautiously. "This is Avery Quinn." "Avery Quinn," a deep, steady voice said. "My name is Master Chief Gideon Walsh. I'm Petty Officer Whitaker's commanding officer. I think we need to talk." Avery stood on Everett Bell's porch with the phone pressed to her ear, heart thudding as the voice repeated his name. "Master Chief Gideon Walsh. I oversee Petty Officer Whitaker's unit. I've read what's coming out about this case, and I believe you and I may have different pieces of the same puzzle." "I'm listening," Avery said, glancing back through the screen door at the old computer, glowing with grainy footage. "The military does not take kindly to one of its people being railroaded by a false report," Walsh said. "We started looking into Officer Carver as soon as his name came up in connection with Whitaker's case. One of his old complaints came from a man who later left active duty, a veteran. Carver roughed him up during a routine stop and lied about it then too." Avery's grip tightened around the phone. That complaint was buried by Chief Locke. Same as the others, Walsh confirmed. We've been building our own file. I'd like to bring what we have to you in person, as soon as possible. There's something you should see too, Avery said, looking back at the camera archive. I think I just found footage of the entire first incident, start to finish. A brief pause followed. Then I'll meet you wherever you need me to be, Walsh said. Not long after, Avery sat in the hospital waiting room with Nolan and Vivian. Everett's footage was open on her laptop. When a tall, broad-shouldered man in dress uniform walked through the doors, people in the hallway naturally turned to look. His presence was quiet but unmistakably commanding. Nolan rose at once. Master Chief, at ease, Whitaker, Walsh said, though his eyes held concern instead of his usual sternness. I came as soon as I could. He shook Vivian's hand gently and expressed his sympathy for Russell's condition. Then he turned toward the laptop. Show me. Avery played the footage from Everett's security camera. The video was grainy and distant, but clear enough. Carver's patrol car pulling up, his aggressive posture from the first moment, his rough grip on Russell's arm, Vivian being shoved back against the porch railing. Then Nolan's approach, calm and controlled, hands visible, no aggression. Exactly as he had described from the beginning. Vivian pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she watched the whole ordeal unfold in unedited truth. This changes everything, Avery murmured, already seeing how the footage would dismantle the doctored clip. For days, the truth had been trapped inside memory, grief, and trembling voices. Now it had shape. It had images. It had a beginning, a middle, and an ending no one could cut away without being exposed. Walsh nodded grimly and opened a folder of his own. And this confirms the pattern goes further back than anyone realized. Inside were copies of the original complaint filed by the veteran Carver had assaulted during a traffic stop. The complaint matched Russell's experience in all the important ways. Excessive force, a false claim of resistance, a report that turned the victim into the threat. Chief Locke buried this one too, Walsh said. Stamped it unfounded soon after it was filed. The veteran left the area not long after, convinced nothing would ever come of it. Avery exhaled slowly as the full shape of the cover-up came into focus. Not one bad officer protected by one careless chief. A pattern stretching back years, deliberately hidden, deliberately ignored. This is enough, Avery said, her voice firm. This is more than enough. I want this handled the right way, Walsh said, looking directly at Nolan. Not buried in a quiet deal where Carver gets a slap on the wrist and Locke walks away clean. I want the truth out in the open. Nolan met his commanding officer's gaze, and, for the first time in days, something in his chest steadied. I want that too. Avery closed the folder carefully, already mapping the path forward. Then we're not settling. We're forcing a public hearing. Every piece of this goes on record. The footage, the falsified reports, Marla's financial motive, Locke's cover-up, all of it in front of the city where nobody can cut it down to a few seconds and call it truth. Vivian looked towards the intensive care doors where Russell was rowering and felt something fierce settle inside her. Then let's make sure everyone sees it, she said. Word of the emergency city council hearing spread quickly, fueled by Simone Hart's relentless coverage and the growing public anger over the doctored clip. When Russell was strong enough to leave the hospital, weak but stable and under strict orders to avoid stress, Avery had already secured an open session. She refused to let the case disappear behind closed doors. The council chamber was packed. Every seat was full. Reporters lined the back wall with cameras raised. Russell sat in the front row in a wheelchair, still recovering, with Vivian's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Nolan sat beside them in dress uniform, spine straight, jaw set, the weight of everything riding on what came next. Chief Graham Locke sat near the front with department officials, his face carefully composed, though his eyes kept flicking toward the side door. Officer Derek Carver sat a few rows back, arms crossed, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Avery rose first. Her voice carried clearly through the silent chamber. What the public was shown was a carefully edited clip, she said. Today, you will see the truth in full. She played Everett's security footage on the chamber projector. The grainy video unfolded before hundreds of eyes. Carver's aggression from the first moment, his grip tightening on Russell's arm. Vivian shoved back against the railing. Nolan's calm, controlled approach after that. Gasps moved through the room. Council members exchanged grim, furious looks. "This is not a man lunging at an officer," Avery said. "This is a son protecting his parents from an officer who never should have touched an elderly man in the first place." Master Chief Walsh rose next and presented the military's findings. The buried complaint from a veteran. The similar treatment. The false report. The pattern of dismissed complaints stretching further back than anyone outside the department had known. Chief Locke did not simply fail to investigate his nephew, Walsh said, his voice steady and unflinching. He protected a pattern of abuse for years at the expense of every person who trusted this department to do its job. Locke's face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of his chair. Then Simone Hart took her turn. She read aloud the financial records connecting Marla Voss to Northline Partners, the company quietly buying properties along Cedar Hollow Lane. She read the meeting notes proving Marla had personally pressured the Whitakers to sell before the emergency call. A murmur swept through the chamber. Heads turned toward Marla, who sat stiffly near the back. Her face drained of color as every eye settled on her. "Is it true," one council member asked, leaning forward, "that you stood to profit financially if your neighbors sold their home?" Marla's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "That call was about safety, I truly believed." "The records say otherwise," the council member said flatly, cutting her off. Marla's voice cracked. Her careful story collapsed in real time, while the room watched. The truth she had hidden behind finally lay bare in front of the community she had tried to manipulate. Carver shifted in his seat. The old arrogance had vanished. "Officer Carver," the council chair said, turning directly toward him. "Do you have anything to say about the difference between your official report and the footage presented here?" Carver opened his mouth, but no convincing answer came out. He glanced toward his uncle, searching for a lifeline that was no longer there. Locke stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, offering nothing. The silence stretched long and damning. Nolan watched it all from the front row. His father's hand found his and squeezed tight. His mother's tears were finally tears of something other than grief. The council chair rose. "Given the gravity of what has been presented today, this body will recess briefly to determine appropriate action." The room erupted into hushed conversation as council members filed out, leaving Carver and Locke sitting beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes. The truth was finally too large and too public for either of them to bury. It had outgrown whispers. It had outgrown reports written behind closed doors. It now lived in the faces of everyone in that room, and every person there understood that pretending not to see it would be a choice. The recess felt endless. Reporters gathered in the hallway, whispering and checking their phones. Russell sat quietly in his wheelchair, his hand still wrapped around Nolan. Mullins. Vivian paced near the chamber doors, unable to sit still. When the council chair returned, the room fell silent so quickly it seemed to pull the air from the chamber. After reviewing the evidence presented today, the chair began, her voice clear through the microphone. "This council finds the original report filed against Nolan Whitaker, unsupported by verified footage. All charges against Mr. Whitaker are to be dropped immediately." A wave of sound rolled through the room. Gasps, soft applause quickly hushed. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth as a sob of relief broke loose. Nolan closed his eyes. The weight that had pressed on him for so long finally lifted from his shoulders. His father's grip tightened around his hand. The chair continued. "Furthermore, given the evidence of falsified police reports and the concealment of body camera footage, this council is formally referring Officer Derek Carver for criminal charges related to filing a false report and violating civil rights." Two uniformed officers standing near the side exit moved forward. Carver's face went white. "Officer Carver," one of them said, pulling cuffs from his belt, You're under arrest. The chamber, filled with murmurs as Carver was turned around, his hands secured behind his back. The same cold click that had once closed around Nolan's wrists now closed around his own. He was led past rows of stunned faces, past the same community members who had watched silently as he humiliated an old man on his own lawn. The chair turned toward Locke, her expression hardening. Chief Locke, given clear evidence that you suppressed multiple legitimate complaints against your nephew over a period of years, this council has no confidence in your continued leadership of this department. Locke rose stiffly. His face was controlled defeat. I'll submit my resignation immediately, he said quietly, and I'll cooperate with any review. It was not an apology. Russell did not expect one anymore. He had learned that some people would rather lose a title than speak the truth from the heart. Still, the room had changed. The silence that once protected Locke was gone, but it was accountability, beginning to move. For now, it had to be enough. Finally, the chair's gaze settled on Marla Voss, who sat frozen near the back of the room. Marla Voss, this council recommends that the Whitaker family seek an immediate restraining order and that a full investigation be opened into your involvement with Northline Partners and any related harassment of your neighbors. Marla said nothing. She stared at her hands, the consequences of greed finally catching up to her in front of the community she had tried to use. The chair closed with one final statement, her eyes finding Russell and Vivian in the front row. On behalf of this city, I offer a formal apology to the Whitaker family for the harm and trauma caused by individuals who were sworn to protect this community. As part of a formal settlement, the city will cover the remaining balance on your mortgage immediately. Vivian broke down completely, burying her face against Russell's shoulder. Russell's eyes filled with tears he no longer tried to hide. Nolan pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called his commanding officer first. His voice cracked with relief as he told him the news. Then he turned to his parents and knelt beside his father's wheelchair. It's over, he said softly. It's really over. No, Russell said, wiping his eyes as a faint smile broke through his exhaustion. It's just beginning. Now we get to actually live again. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed for statements. But for the first time since everything began, the Whitakers did not feel like a story being told about them. They felt like a family whose truth had finally been heard. And, for people who had spent days watching strangers argue over clips, headlines, and lies, being heard felt almost like breathing again. Later, after one final medical check, Nolan called Vivian's sister and repeated the words as if he still could not quite believe them himself. All charges dropped. Carver's under arrest. Locke is gone. We won. Vivian sat beside Russell, holding his hand, watching their son's face light up with something she had not seen in far too long. Not just relief. Hope. Real. Solid. Finally theirs to keep. The sun spilled warm and golden across Cedar Hollow Lane, the same kind of light that had once fallen over the Whitaker garden, before everything changed. Russell sat in the passenger seat of Nolan's car as it pulled to the curb. His color had returned. His strength was slowly rebuilding. You didn't have to make a fuss, Russell said, though there was no real protest in his voice. Dad, Nolan said, putting the car in park. Look outside. Russell turned toward the window and went still. The entire street had gathered on their lawn. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder across the grass. The teenage boy who had once filmed in stunned silence now held a handwritten sign welcoming Russell home. The woman from across the street stood near the porch with a tray of lemonade. Families from the far end of the block, people Russell barely knew by name, had come to stand on his lawn. Vivian stepped out onto the porch, her hands pressed to her chest, tears already forming as she watched her husband and son step out of the car. "Welcome home!" she called, her voice breaking with joy instead of grief. Those words carried more than a greeting. They carried all the nights she had prayed beside a hospital bed, all the fear she had swallowed in front of her son, and all the faith she had refused to let die. Russell made his way slowly up the front walk, leaning lightly on Nolan's arm. The crowd applauded and called greetings. Some neighbors shook his hand. Others offered quiet apologies for staying silent too long. Avery Quinn stood near the edge of the lawn, watching with quiet satisfaction. A folder of finalized paperwork was tucked under her arm. The settlement was complete. The restraining order had been filed. The case had closed in the Whitakers' favor. Beside her, Simone Hart took a few photos. Not for another headline this time, but because the moment felt worth remembering. "You did good work," Avery said, glancing at her. "We both did," Simone replied. A car door closed behind them, and Master Chief Gideon Walsh stepped out in full uniform, having driven a long way just to be there. He crossed the lawn directly to Nolan, who straightened instinctively. "Master Chief, at ease, Whitaker." Walsh extended a hand. "Your clearance has been fully reinstated, effective immediately." Nolan exhaled, something in his chest finally loosening after all the uncertainty. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Walsh said, his eyes drifting briefly to Russell and Vivian on the porch. "You earned this the moment you put your family first and your training second. That is exactly the kind of man this uniform should represent." Nolan nodded, unable to find words big enough for the moment. He shook his commander's hand again, firmer this time. The afternoon unfolded slowly and warmly. No one tried to pretend the damage had never happened. The bruises had been real. The fear had been real. The silence had been real. But healing does not always begin by forgetting. Sometimes it begins when people finally stand in the same yard and choose to do better. Plates of food passed between neighbors who had once only waved from across the street. Now they shared stories and laughter on the Whitakers' lawn like old friends. Russell sat in a lawn chair someone had brought out for him, telling old memories and occasionally glancing toward Nolan with quiet pride whenever his son's name came up. Vivian moved through the crowd, hugging neighbors and thanking Avery and Simone. Her exhaustion had not disappeared, but something lighter had returned to her face, something close to peace. As the sun lowered behind the rooftops, the crowd slowly thinned. Neighbors drifted back to their homes until only the Whitakers remained on the porch. The lawn grew quiet again. Chairs and tables waited to be folded away. Nolan stood at the top of the porch steps, looking out over the street where it had all begun. The same patch of grass where his father had been grabbed. The same place where he had stood between his parents and a man who saw only a threat instead of a son. He turned to face Russell and Vivian, standing together by the front door, watching him with quiet pride. Nolan straightened his shoulders, squared his stance, and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Russell lifted his chin. Vivian found her husband's hand and held it tight. Down the street, a few lingering neighbors paused to watch. Then they began to clap, softly at first, then with more strength. The sound rose into the evening air and carried across the lawn that had witnessed the family's darkest day, and now, at last, their brightest one. And maybe that is what this story leaves behind. Not just anger over what went wrong, but a quiet reminder of what can still be made right. It reminds us that an ordinary home can hold extraordinary courage, and that dignity can live in a garden, at a kitchen table, in a hospital room, and in the steady voice of someone who refuses to let fear decide the ending. One lie can wound a family, but one truth, protected by courage, can begin to heal a whole community. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not safety. And dignity does not disappear just because someone powerful refuses to see it. Every choice matters. The call we make, the story we tell, the hand we raise to help, or the hand we keep in our pocket when someone needs us. Justice may not always arrive quickly, but when people refuse to give up on what is true, it can still find its way home. So live with care. Stand with compassion. Take responsibility for the harm you cause. And never forget that every person you meet carries a life, a family, and a worth far deeper than anything you can see at first glance. If this story moved you, leave a like to support the channel, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On the screen, I've chosen a couple of special stories for you. Have a wonderful day.